Hello, everyone, and welcome to St. Raphael's Choir Connection. My name is Christopher Alt. I am a Jesuit scholastic, and I'll say a little bit more about my life as a Jesuit throughout this presentation and this tonight. But first, let me just opportunity to thank Karen Main, to thank Father Tom and the pastoral staff, to Sarah and Vocations for helping out with the tech side of things, and of course, to all of you for tuning in. I am delighted to be here with you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to offer this reflection. I also just want to share a shout out to the St. Raphael Choir. I'm from Oshkosh originally. I really live in Chicago. Occasionally when I get up, especially during times when I'm able to get up to Oshkosh and sing in the choir, you are so warm and welcoming, inviting, and I just want to thank you for that. So shout out to you. And thank you for your ministry. So some of you may recognize, some of you don't. Maybe if you recognize me, it's from my time singing in the choir. If you don't happen to know me, it's nice to meet you. My parents, Ed and Mary Alt, are parishioners at St. Raphael's. So Oshkosh is where I grew up. 18 years there. This is the closest I've been to home, and have lived to home since I was 18 years old. As I mentioned, I am a Jesuit. I'm a member of the Society of Jesus. I'm 2.5 years, God willing, away from ordination. Currently, I work at one of our high schools on the west side of Chicago, Christ the King Jesuit College Prep, and I work there as a school worker and as a therapist. Our theme, I was thinking about what we could come together and gather around and about. Obviously, we are well into the season of Lent, and I realize that next week as we celebrate the Feast of the Annunciation. So I want to spend some time with God and with Gabriel and with Mary this octave before the feast to prepare our hearts and our minds so that next week when we do celebrate, we can enter more fully, deeply into that mystery. So tonight I've titled our time of reflection, Discern Our Vocations, with Botticelli's Mary, Lessons on God's Call and Principles of Discernment. Here is to look at Mary and her vocation story, how it might impact our own, and what lessons it has for us. So let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Loving and gracious God, thank you for bringing us together and for drawing us ever closer into your friendship. You visited Mary in the ordinariness of her life, and so too you visit us in the ordinariness of our life. Mary, though not completely sure of all that the Annunciation would mean, consented to your invitation and offered you a courageous yes. May her witness strengthen us. May her mothering encourage a similar yes to accept our vocations. You're calling us to mission and ministry. May the Spirit who is with Mary be with us this evening. May it raise our awareness and awaken in us our desire to do God's will. May it open our eyes and our ears to receive what you desire to say. And we ask this through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. So as I mentioned, the heart of tonight's reflection is on the Annunciation. And the story, as you all know, the story of a young Jewish girl, living in Palestine 2,000 some years ago, and she gets this marvelous invitation, a special invitation to be the mother of the Word incarnate. And so tonight, to help us enter more deeply into that mystery, we're going to get some help from a 15th century painting that depicts the scene, and it's by Sandro Botticelli, painted in 1489. The first thing I'm going to do is just invite you to take a look at this image, to take it in. You know, Botticelli offers us a theology not expressed in words here, but in color and line and form. So just sit with this image for a moment and ask yourself, as you recall the words from Luke, where we get this image from and this story from, ask yourself these questions. What do you notice about this painting? What sticks out to you, at first glance? What speaks to you this evening? Just take a moment with it. As we recall the story again from the gospel, and here it is in this form before us, this painting, we realize fundamentally, overall, globally speaking, that this is a depiction of a vocation story. This is Mary's vocation story in a snapshot. And a word here about vocation, about the word vocation. One of my pet peeves as a religious, when I hear people talk about and pray for vocations, and often they use it in, it's not unusual for people to use it in a more restricted sense. They think often it means, when they hear vocation, that it means or refers to religious life or priesthood. It's only for someone who wears a collar like this or a habit or something like that. And then every so often, or maybe a lot, we hear about this vocation shortage. A vocation shortage, but I'm not quite sure that that's true. Kathleen Hughes at the Chicago Theological Union talks a little bit about this so-called vocation shortage. And what she writes is this. She says, what is in remarkably short supply is not vocations, but the general awareness that each of us has received a unique call from God. It's the general unawareness, which is the real vocation crisis for today. So tonight, I want to frame this whole reflection in terms of vocation, God's call. And the whole point tonight is to raise awareness about how God is calling each one of us. What is our vocation? Because the reality is, after we've discerned and decided the bigger parts of our life, it's not a done deal. We know that. We constantly have to keep asking, okay, God, now what is the next step you want me to take? And as we know, there are different kinds of vocations. Quite simply, I think of them in three different kind of categories. There's the big capital V vocation, and then these are the big life-altering, often permanent decisions that are before us that we have to make and that we have to discern. To get married or to have children, or we call it to the single life or a religious life, a priesthood, and so on and so forth. Mary here is confronted with a life-altering decision. Does she want to do this, or does she not want to be a part of this? And then underneath that, there are the more mid-size vocations, but still very important that we have to discern. If you're a teen, usually the biggest decision in life is where you're going to go off to college, or maybe you're going to decide maybe you don't want to do that and go off into a trade or into something else, pursue something else. Later on, then maybe it's what other profession to pursue, or should I change jobs, or should we move, or who to vote for? What are the public policies that we want to support? All of these are things that we have to discern. And discernment, by the way, is that term which refers to the process of prayerfully making a decision. So we have to discern those big capital V vocations, those mid-sized vocations as well. An example of one of those kind of mid-sized vocations, I was recently talking with a woman in her mid-60s, and she commented, she said, everyone is so interested in helping young people find their vocation, helping young people find their way through that stage of life. But she says, there are those in the latter half of life that need help discerning what's next too. And I thought that's a good point. And so it's good to come together again on a night like this and reflect on our vocations and some principles of discernment. So the big capital V, the mid-size, and then there are, of course, those vocations of everyday life. What should I do today? How will I engage my family this morning? My partner and I got in a fight last night. What should I do to repair that rupture? What kind of people do I want to invite into my life? Or how do I want to be a friend? And who am I going to call into my life to be friends? And so on and so forth. So tonight we're going to reflect on Mary's vocation story in the hopes that it can guide us with the choices before us. And we ask Mary to help illumine our own path. And to do that, we're going to focus on 5 different areas of the painting and reflect together on what those lessons and principles of discernment are for us. So diving right in, focus number 1. As mentioned, there are so many depictions of Mary. The first thing that we do when we take in a painting is maybe just to notice the space. Sometimes artists place Mary in a scene with a blank background. Sometimes she's on a throne. Other times she's in a living room or a chapel or a church or a portico. But here Botticelli imagines her in what I assume is her home, and maybe even her bedroom perhaps. And the point here is, she's typically, regardless of whoever's painting it, whatever the painting is, Mary is in a place in the Annunciation scene, in a place that's familiar to her, a place that suggests intimacy and familiarity. And I think the spiritual message and the principle of discernment here is that God meets us where we are. That wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that's where God is going to call you. It's the stuff of everyday life that is the raw data of discernment. And when I say God calls you wherever you are, I don't mean just physical location, right? I mean wherever you are socially, wherever you are mentally, emotionally, biologically, spiritually, whatever, age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, wherever you find yourself economically or culturally or politically, God can and will meet you there. That God can use and work in and with all of that. Vanita Hampton Wright at ignatianspirituality.com writes this. She says, no matter where we are, the divine seeks us and desires us and waits for the opportunity to meet us. Fortunately for us, God meets us where we are and in ways we are able to perceive the encounter. A Jesuit brother of mine, a friend, Jim Martin, talks about his work as a spiritual director. And he says, again, God meets people where they are. For some people, that's through relationships. And for others, that's through books. And others, that's through nature. God speaks to us in very personal ways and tailored to our own circumstances. He talks about the Apostle Thomas and how Jesus meets him. Meets the needs that he has after the resurrection. That Thomas needs physical proof, and Jesus meets him with that, with physical proof. So too, for us, we have to look around and see the very personal and unique ways God encounters us and invites us to believe. So it's not as if God says, okay, first I got to look at all the progress you've made. You got to be in a certain place, and then I'll show up. No. God meets you right where you are. It's a good first principle of discernment and to keep in mind. And with that, we move right along into focus number 2, Mary's little book. So it's striking how many Annunciation scenes depict Mary with a book. No matter where the artist situates her, Mary's book is nearby. And sometimes it's resting on her lap. Other times it's off in a corner. Sometimes it's the book closed with a page marked by one of Mary's fingers. Or it can be as it is here in Botticelli's painting, on a lectern. And so even though the Gospel of Luke never mentions a book, it's a common motif. And so we can ask the questions, wonder what she's reading. We can ponder this. That's worthy to ponder. But that's not what I'm going to invite us to focus on tonight so much as the book per se. What I'm going to invite us to focus on is that Mary looks up. In every depiction I know, what the book is there, but she's not looking at it. She's looking up. And what's the spiritual message here? What's the principle of discernment here? I think it suggests that there comes a time when we have to move from preparation to formation, when we have to move from information to transformation. And this is kind of how I think about it. We know that Mary was a good Jew. We know that she was interested in Torah. We know that she was interested in Hebrew scripture. We know that she was pious and devoted to the religious practices of her day. She was interested in that preparatory work, preparing herself to receive God. But she also allows herself, when God shows up, to look up and engage the God that is right there in front of her. Nothing really could have prepared Mary for that moment. The Jews of the time, incarnation was not a part of their religious sensibilities. And yet, here Mary not only looks up when God shows up, but she's open to receiving surprises from God. And I recall in my own discernment experience, this idea of moving from preparation to formation. When I was first discerning the Society of Jesus, first things first, I went to the website and checked them out there. I got my hands on books about Jesuit history and learned about their charism. I did what I could to collect the information. There also came a point when I had to engage at another level. I really wasn't going to know what it was like to be a Jesuit until I became a Jesuit. And it's that same principle is active in so many different areas of our lives. This idea from preparation to formation. There's also another sense, and this is what I'm hinting at when I mean information, moving from information to transformation. Think about our Christian practices, and let's just take the ones that we do here for Lent. The traditional practices of prayer and alms and fasting. We do the spiritual readings. We watch the reflections like this. We listen to podcasts. We say the rosary. We go to Mass. These are all good things. Obviously, I highly recommend them. We should continue to do them. But I think we have to keep in the back of our mind that we can become so fixated on a particular regimen or a particular routine. This is what I do to fulfill my Christian duty. I've said all the prayers and now I'm good. And we fail to take it to the next level. We get the information, but then it's about the movement to transformation. We sometimes fail to enter more deeply into relationship with God because we're so set on that routine. And then we really miss the point of what those practices were pointing toward in the first place. We have to ask ourselves, are all of these practices just giving us aha insights? Is it remaining kind of an intellectual exercise? Or are these practices leading us to a deeper interiority? Are they leading us to a deeper relationship? Just to put it bluntly, we know those people who can quote the Bible and the Catechism chapter and verse, and that's wonderful. But there's also sometimes a sense lacking of that deeper interiority. And how is that they have this great knowledge, but is it leading them to be kinder and tender and to engage others and God at that deeper level, at that deeper transformational level? One of my favorite theologians, Karl Rahner, one of the greatest Catholic theologians of the last century, talked about knowing God is more important than knowing about God. And there's a distinction there, and that's the distinction that I'm getting at here. I have an image next to Mary of Moses. And considering the story of Moses is just another way that I think about moving from information to transformation and getting this sense of spiritual flexibility of allowing ourselves to look up out of our routine. Moses, as we know, he was tending the flock back in Exodus 3. We can go read it there. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of a bush. And then the text says, then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight. And when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush. And then Moses said, here I am. Moses is out doing his duty. He's out looking after the lost sheep, and then he sees this burning bush, and he hears this voice, and he ducks, and he turns aside, and he's able to exercise that spiritual flexibility. Compare this with the image of the Israelites in the same, throughout the story of the Exodus and in those first chapters, those first books of the Bible in the Pentateuch. Compare this with the Israelites. God refers to the people as stiff-necked. There's an inflexibility, there's a rigidity, a hardness, a myopia, an inability to turn and see God in their midst. So the idea is this: don't get stuck in regimens of just doing our Christian duty that we miss the point. What are all these things doing to lead us to greater relationship with God? Our families and our occupations, our culture, our church, our religious practices, again, these are all good things. But the word of caution here is if we stubbornly fix our gaze on any one of these things, if we are stiff-necked and do not turn aside and see how God is using those as sacramentals, things that lead us to transformation, well, then we will have missed the point. Two more things here, just to use a Eucharistic image. Someone once said, what if the bread changes at liturgy, but we don't? That also gets to the sense of this. We know as Catholics, yes, we believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. We believe that the bread and wine has been transformed. We understand it at an intellectual, cognitive level. But then do we allow ourselves, just like the bread, to be transformed? We may have the information, we may know what we need to say to be good Catholics, but the next step is leading to that transformation. A hazard during this Lenten season. People do their almsgiving and praying and fasting. The other day I saw an Instagram feed. Someone said fasting without prayer is just a diet. Another way of just getting to this point of moving from information to transformation. We don't want to just parrot things. We want to move from that preparation to formation and information to transformation. The second focus and the second principle of discernment. At this point, just to give us a breather here, let's take a moment to consider what has been said so far. Taking a look at focus 1, focus 2, the first and second principles of discernment, and then these reflection questions. So we'll just take about a minute and a half. Don't try and cover all of the questions. Just pick the one that you're drawn to, and then a particular question that you're drawn to, and just spend some time with Jesus now in your own private prayer. We'll see you in a little bit. Okay, we'll come back here. Moving on to focus number 3 of this painting by Botticelli. The next thing to focus on are the postures. And this was really the very first thing that I noticed about the image was the body language and the positioning of Gabriel and Mary in the composition, their facial expressions, the way that they were positioned in the work. And the first figure to focus on is Gabriel. And Gabriel we know as God's representative, God's stand-in the story. And first recall some of the other depictions that you can probably call to mind in your mind's eye. In some of the other depictions, Gabriel is standing. Other times he's towering over Mary. Other times he's bowing. Other times he holds a scepter. Other times there's no angel at all. There's just the Spirit descending upon Mary in the form of a dove. Sometimes Gabriel is a beam of light, like in the famous contemporary depiction by Tanner. All of these are worthy of reflection. All of these communicate something. But what I particularly love about Botticelli's version here is the profound humility in the way this herald of God approaches Mary. Compare this with the previous story where Gabriel comes to Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, and he stands before Zechariah and says, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God." That's not what we get here. Botticelli gives us Gabriel who's on his knees. The look on Gabe's face communicates something like, yeah, I'm an archangel and I've seen some things, but even this is a new experience for me. He raises his hand to Mary, softly and gently. He reaches out, maybe even with caution, and I imagine it even with perhaps a tremble, as one might do if all of a sudden they were walking in the woods there up in Wisconsin and they turn around and you're suddenly approached by a doe and her fawn in the wild. This wanting to reach out in this very cautious, trembling kind of a way. And here we don't know. Has Gabriel already made the announcement? Either way, whether he has or not, it's as if Gabriel is holding his breath. What's Mary gonna say? What's she gonna do? And the spiritual insight here, and I think the lesson, the principle of discernment is this. Gabriel is God's messenger. And bringing it back to this notion, tying it in with this notion of vocation, is to remember this principle that God is a God of invitation, which is to say that God is not a God who is interested in coercion. God is compassionate, approaches with care, is interested in our consent and in our cooperation. Many times I think our image of God is one that twists our arms into doing things, but that's not what we get here. Not a Santa Claus God off in some unseen and has a list, checking it twice kind of a thing. No, Botticelli suggests, and I think he's correct here, for our response to truly be free, if we are to offer a real yes, well, then it has to be a real invitation. And a second point here, I think Gabriel's posture can teach us a thing or two about evangelization. All of us are called to evangelize. That's a part of all of our vocations, to announce the good news. And I think it's important to take some time to think about how we're going to do that. What's our strategy for evangelizing? How to be bold, yes, but also humble when we approach others and share the good news. Just to share with you, I am often very saddened, and it's brings me to desolation at times, the way that I see Catholics interact with other Catholics, or Catholics interacting with other Christians. It's one thing to disagree with each other. It is a whole nother thing to push back with these vicious hysterical attacks, which sometimes you see on social media and in the media in general. We know this is happening in our politics. Unfortunately, this is happening in our church as well. The kind of contempt and aggression with which you see people meet each other. So this principle, is that what we're being taught? Is that how we're asked to engage? It doesn't seem to be, at least the God that I know of, the God that is represented here in this picture. Okay, a less extreme, but perhaps more common, experience. Every so often I get emails, I get messages from parents, grandparents who are wondering how to engage their children or their grandchildren who aren't Catholic, or maybe they're no longer practicing or don't have the same views as them. And Gabriel here again gives us a model. How do we approach? We approach with respect, and we approach with sensitivity and compassion, and we actively listen instead of just listening to respond. We try to see the other person's viewpoint and presume that the other person is acting in good faith when they say what they're saying and doing what they're doing. We engage non-judgmentally and out of a spirit of true curiosity and true care. So the picture is one of how God not only deals with us, as symbolized by Gabriel, but also how we can engage with others. Okay, shifting our focus now from Gabriel to Mary. Mary's posture is one that has come to mean a lot to me personally, but it's one that communicates something I think important to all of us. Notice Mary's body language. Look at the way she's contorted. She both draws back and she draws forward. She resists, but she's also compelled to reach out. There's something of an approach avoidance thing going on here, some ambivalence in the drama. And isn't that a part of our own vocation stories as well, if you think about it? To pause here and offer just a little bit of my own vocation story. So when I was about 5 years old, my family and I, we started worshiping at the Newman Center there at University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And that really was the place that gave me the vision of my vocation. It planted the seed, as it were. And so I'm 5 or 6 years old. I didn't have the language to express it, of course, right? But I remember sitting in the congregation and in the pew and sensing, even as a child, whatever is happening here in this space, whatever's happening in this place is sacred, with the people and the preaching and the music and the songs. I have to be a part of it for the rest of my life. And so, in other words, I wanted to be a priest since I was a kid. And I remember asking my parents for a lectionary for my 7th birthday. I got it. So I was able to play house and priest at home. But to play priest at home. And if you had asked me as an adolescent, there was no doubt in my mind that come 18 years old, I was going to join the seminary. Well, long story short, that didn't happen. Why? Life happened. It's complicated, for so many of us. And that next long stretch of my life is what I call the 20-plus year approach avoidance conflict concerning my own vocation. And I'll spare you the details tonight, but that was a long time of whether or not I wanted to do this. Anyway, I joined the society in 2016, so I finally was called into that. And for the first 2 years is what we call novitiate. So that's a house of discernment in St. Paul. So I'm there for 2 years. 3 weeks before August of 2018, when I was to profess my first vows of perpetual poverty and chastity and obedience, well, I get cold feet and I have this major pullback and spiritually contorted in that sense. And I started thinking and praying again with this image of Mary and the ambivalence there. And it was such a consoling image. And it ultimately helped me say, yes, this is where I want to be. This is where God wants me to be. So back to Botticelli. These postures are communicating something to us, and I think they have something to teach us. And the first is, As we discern how to do God's will, it's okay and it's normal to feel both this approach and this avoidance. To those who don't have that conflict, all the power to you. But for those who aren't like that, it's okay to be ambivalent when we first hear the call. And the second lesson is to let your deepest desires lead you. To let the deepest impulses lead you, just as Mary let her deepest impulses lead her. A nuance here with this: the importance of the body in decision making, in our discernment. We remember that our faith is an incarnational one, that the body is important. Don't forget about the body when we're making decisions. And I mean this literally. Sometimes the body knows things before our minds do. I think we have a tendency at times to intellectualize everything and to rationalize everything. And we have to pay attention to the stirrings of the mind. That's for sure. But then there are those moments where we overdo it and we start to ruminate and we start to think that we have to have everything planned out before we make our next move forward. But Mary shows us that the body has a wisdom of its own. So when we're making these decisions, be aware literally of the physical sensations that are going on with you as you bring whatever it is before you to Jesus. Mary Oliver writes in Wild Geese, in that famous poem of hers, "You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." That's what I'm seeing Mary here. She may be filled with fear and confusion, but she's letting the soft animal of her body love what it loves and reaches out to God. So how is God using your body and your emotions to draw you closer? A final point here about Mary's posture and body language. There is the reality, there comes a time when each of us has to make a decision. So take a look at Mary's face. She's looking down at the floor, and the way that the tiles are arranged at her feet, it's as if Mary is looking at some invisible line on the ground. She can stay where she is, or she can cross the line and commit. I remember a Jesuit brother once told me, Christopher, freedom is found on the other side of commitment. And I've been pondering that, and it seems to be true for Mary, and it seemed to be true for me. And so now I say, what say you? The third focus, the postures, the principles of discernment there. The fourth focus, the foreground and the background of the painting. So we all know that Mary does, in fact, reach out across the threshold. She gives her consent. She offers her glorious yes, and she crosses the line. So the drama that's happening in the foreground of the image is usually what captures our attention first. But then we start noticing, what is that happening behind Gabriel there in the background? If you focus in there, we can see there's an image of the city on the left, a ship sailing on a winding river away from the fortified wall towards the city on the left there. What here is the spiritual insight, the spiritual nugget, the principle of discernment? And what I suggest and offer for your consideration here is that once Mary says yes, it's going to mean that she has to give herself over to ministry that will be for the entire world. Once we say yes, and so too for us, once we say yes to whatever it is God is calling us to, once we own our vocation, that's going to draw us out of our personal space and out of our comfort zone and out into the wider world. That's, I think, the overall idea here. Our vocation is always going to be a call to mission and ministry in some form, in some way or another. In other words, to put it this way, there really is no such thing as a private vocation. There's no such thing as a private calling. Mission is constitutive a necessary part in each of our callings. A concrete example here. God may have called you to married life. There's obviously something quite personal about that. But do you consider your marriage first and foremost about mission? Have you asked yourself, how can your marriage and your family life be a Christian witness to those around you? When people see you in relationship, are they going to say that they see God working in and through it for the betterment of the world and for the upbuilding of the kingdom? These are things to ask ourselves, moving from that vocation moment to mission. And we can ask that about our state of life, our occupation. Are these things bringing glory to God, and are they leading us to serve others? Our vocations will draw us out into the world in need. And this is one of the very classic, has become a classic definition of vocation, that your greatest joy plus the world's greatest need is what your vocation is. Where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest need, that's your calling. Our vocations are not personal. So have you considered how you are being called into the wider world? How you are called by God to meet some of the world's greatest needs? Think of all the needs in the world. The call to racial justice and economic justice, to serve those who are hungry and those who have housing insecurity. What about care for a common home and climate justice? How about meeting all the needs of those who suffer from all the isms and the phobias of the world? The racism and the sexism and the homophobia and so on and so forth. Our vocations are tied in with our discipleship, and all of us are called to be disciples. We also realize that disciples are those whom God missions. So another breather here before we move on to our final point of focus. Again, just take a minute or two and consider one or two of these questions. And on to our final focus for this evening. Posture revisited, but also looking at two elements in the composition the lily that Gabriel holds in the foreground, and then the tree in the background. So first the lily, which has become symbolic over the many centuries, and it's become representative of many different things. Here, probably associated with Mary's purity. But even more basic, the lily, and really all flowers, represent a newness of life, a freshness, a fragrance, a beautiful fragrance. Flowers are a sign of life and a sign of joy. And that's why they become associated with the Easter feast and with resurrection. Okay. But notice as your eyes move up the stalk of the lily, it mingles and intertwines with the tree outside. And my hunch here is that Botticelli not only has the tree of life in the Garden of Eden in mind, the place of humanity's infamous fall, but also the tree of the cross, the instrument of Christ's suffering and death. And what's the kind of this, again, the spiritual insight here in the context of a vocation, which we've been talking about? Well, I don't think we have to reach too far in our own experience to know what he's getting at here. There are times in our life and in our vocation where it's going to lead to a place of great joy. Those moments of annunciation, those aha moments, those times when our mission, everything is going great and we're feeling wonderful and we're getting results and we're on a happy trajectory. This is the lily. But we all know too, when we embrace our vocation, which we do in love, that will also bring us some pain. That might lead us to some dark places. There are going to be moments of fear and frustration and places of desolation along the way. And we're going to face deaths. Any number of them, figurative and also very real ones. Our vocations intertwine all the good and the bad and the ugly. We know this whether we're religious or whether we're a spouse, partnered with someone, or whether we are a parent in this particular job or ministry and so on and so forth. It's all a mixture of these things. And that's where I want to tie in this final point about Mary's posture. She's standing. She's standing here in the Annunciation, and she also stands at the foot of the cross on Good Friday. We know the words of the Stabat Mater. At the cross her station keeping, Mary stood in sorrow weeping, when her son was crucified. At the cross your sorrow sharing, all your grief and torment bearing, let me stand and mourn with you. We may remember that song. We may have sung it. We may sing it in just a week or so. Mary standing, again, at the Annunciation here at the foot of the cross. What's going on here and what's the point? Ronald Rolheiser sees this posture of standing as symbolically important. And this is what he writes. He says, in the Gospels, we want to pay attention to the person of Mary, the model of discipleship. And she gets it right as she stands under the cross. Why isn't she on the ground weeping, hysterical? What is she doing just standing there? Why is the fact that she's standing significant? And then Rolheiser answers those questions and says, on the surface, it seems that she's not doing anything at all. She doesn't speak. She doesn't protest. She doesn't try and stop the crucifixion or plead Jesus' innocence. Overtly, she's doing nothing. But at a deeper level, she's doing all that can be done when one is standing under the weight of the cross. Her standing shows that she's holding the tension. That's what that standing is representing, holding the tension, standing in strength, refusing to give back in kind. She's resisting in a deeper way. I think the overall point is a good one. That while, yes, in reality, there are going to be moments of darkness, and this is the social worker and the therapist in me speaking now, we shouldn't shame when people cry and protest and shout and even be hysterical. There are times when that's a part of being human. But the symbolism here about the standing is that ultimately our goal is to take this, whether it's we're standing in pain or in joy or a mixture of both, to be able to do as Mary does, to lean into the joy in those moments, but also to absorb the pain the best way we can. And lest we transmit it, as Richard Rohr says, we take it into ourselves and we transform it. To transform the pain, lest we transmit it. So those are some reflections on vocation, some principles of discernment. This evening, to close up, we'll sing, we won't sing, but we'll listen to a song, Gabriel's Message by the Good Shepherd Band. And there are some questions here again for your meditation. And I just want to say thank you again for tuning in tonight. And if you have any questions, you can email me. You can follow me at these particular media platforms. And I wish you many graces in this Lenten journey, and then into the joyous Easter season that we will soon celebrate afterwards. Graces as you continue to discern your vocation and you seek these principles of discernment, and here tonight using Gabriel and Mary as our models. Peace to you all.
The angel Gabriel from heaven came. His wings as drifted snow, his eyes as flame. All hail, said he, thou lowly maiden Mary, most highly favored lady, Gloria. For know a blessed mother thou shalt be, all generations laud and honor thee. Thy son shall be Emmanuel, by seers foretold, most highly favored lady, Gloria. The gentle Mary meekly bowed her head. To me be as it pleaseth God, she said. My soul shall laud and magnify his holy name, most highly favored lady, of her Emmanuel the Christ was born in Bethlehem, all on a Christmas morn, and everyone throughout the world The angel Gabriel from heaven came. His wings as drifted snow, his eyes as flame. All hail, said he, thou lowly maiden Mary, most highly favored lady. Glory